As the war dragged on, Hans and Sophie wrestled with their complicity in an immoral regime. But how and why did this internal struggle turn into external action when it had failed to do so for others? To explore the factors that led the White Rose to protest, I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Dr. Rebecca Carter-Shand, Director of Program on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Thank you for having me. Stories of rescue and resistance during the Holocaust are among the most compelling and popular narratives of the Holocaust. They inspire people to develop compassion and a moral compass, as well as honor people who did some measure of good during very difficult times. Accounts of resistance also show what was possible. This is especially important in the post-war period, as many Germans claimed ignorance of what had happened around them under the Nazi regime. And so stories like the White Rose show that at least some people were still engaging in difficult ethical issues in a dictatorship, and they took risks to turn ideas into action. But it's important here today, especially to remember that acts of resistance were the exception, not the rule. It was not very common at all to find resistance. Moreover, resistance was entangled with accommodation to the regime and even complicity, especially regarding the Nazi treatment of Jews. So rather than thinking about people's behavior as existing on a spectrum, from resistance on one end and complicity on the other end, we need to acknowledge that individual people and the institutions that they were part of could behave in ways that constituted both resistance and complicity. And when we look at examples of Christians who did engage in resistance, we can see that resistance took different forms, and indeed was resisting different things or different aspects of Nazism. Just a few examples. For instance, Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany refused to participate in demonstrations of allegiance to Hitler and the Nazi government. For example, they refused to give the Hitler salute, fly the Nazi flag, send their children to Nazi youth groups, and participate in military service. In a different way, we can look at the Quakers who quietly went about their activities to help Jews and show solidarity. While they generally stayed under the radar, rather than making big public statements about their nonconformity, in this way, they were actually able to give aid and hiding to a large number of German Jews. Third example, one of the most famous German resistors, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Protestant pastor and theologian, he trained clergy in an illegal seminary of the Confessing Church in the 30s, and later became involved in the German resistance movement, using his ecumenical contacts abroad to inform them of German resistance plans. A fourth example would be Paul Braune, who was the director of a church-run asylum, who wrote a 12-page memorandum in 1940, which was sent to the government, describing and condemning the government's killing of asylum patients as part of the Nazi euthanasia program, or the T4 program. Now, even though these examples of Christian resistance are few and far between, they are important context for understanding the White Rose and the actions of the young people and students in Munich. For a country that was overwhelmingly Christian, as was already mentioned, around 95% of Germans belonged to a Christian community, the White Rose group was remarkably religiously diverse. Among its members were Protestants, Catholics, they had an Orthodox Christian, and adherents of anthroposophy, Buddhism, and Eastern thought. Christoph Probst had a Jewish mother. And they were interested in ethical and religious issues and read widely. And I want to highlight just two individuals who we know directly influenced and inspired the group. The first is Bishop von Galen, who is Catholic Bishop of Münster. Von Galen is remembered as one of the few clergy who publicly criticized and denounced aspects of Nazi policy. In 1941, von Galen preached 3 sermons from the pulpit, which criticized aspects of government policy toward the church. And the third sermon condemned in very strong language the government's clandestine mass killing of patients with disabilities living in institutions in Germany. And it's one of the rare cases we have of a clergy person criticizing Nazi policy from the pulpit. And since the sermons were printed and circulated, they had a very broad reach, far beyond just the people who happened to be at church that Sunday, including the White Rose. When this happened, when the sermon was given and then circulated, then Nazis, of course, were furious, but in the end decided to hold off punishing him until after the war, since he was such a high-profile church leader, and they wanted to maintain the public's support of the war effort. Of course, at the time, they were fully confident that the Germans would win the war and that they would then deal with him at that time. Another individual to influence the White Rose was the philosopher and convert to Catholicism, Theodor Hecker. In the early years of the Nazi regime, he was quite outspoken in his criticism of the Nazis, which resulted in him being prohibited from speaking in public or publishing anymore. And at that point, he did continue his writings privately, writing a journal called Journal in the Night, which was an outlet for him to articulate and develop his anti-Nazi views and his also spiritual reflection on how an individual ought to live and behave in a dictatorship. Hecker knew the members of the White Rose personally and met with them to read and discuss his writings. He was arrested for his connection with the group after the events where the leaflets were discovered and the Scholls and others were arrested. He too was arrested, although he was released, and he died of natural causes right around the end of the war. And so we see both of these influences, Bishop von Galen and Theodor Hecker did not meet the same level of punishment as some of the members of the White Rose movement itself. But I'd like to return to my opening comments about finding both resistance and complicity entangled together. Because as much as we love to find heroes in this history, we must acknowledge that neither von Galen nor Hecker spoke out against the Nazi treatment of Jews. Not the social isolation of the early 30s, not the stripping of civil liberties and citizenship, and not the deportation of Jews to the East. In fact, von Galen held rather typical anti-Jewish prejudices, and Hecker's day job was writing for a publication that regularly published anti-Semitic content. And so I challenge us today to really grapple with this history and its meaning for us today. We must hold both of these truths in tension. On the one hand, these displays of moral courage that we've heard about today that positively influenced young people to resist in their own way, and on the other hand, displays of moral failing in choosing to stay silent about Nazi anti-Semitism. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Cartershand. Though the White Rose drew inspiration from figures like Count von Galen, their goals were in some ways more radical. Whereas von Galen spoke in protest of specific policies, the White Rose called for a wholesale overthrow of the Nazi regime. The first of 4 of the White Rose leaflets were released in quick succession in June and July of 1942, circulated throughout Munich by mail. These were largely the work of Hans and his close friend and fellow soldier Alexander Schmorl, another core member of the White Rose group. These leaflets were more philosophical in tone, appealing to the reader's intellectual and moral sensibilities. Scattered with quotations from Goethe, Lao Tzu, and Schiller, these early leaflets were sometimes meandering. Nonetheless, the main themes are clear: the criminality of the regime, the necessity of passive resistance, and the metaphysical implications of the war. Initially, Sophie did not know about her brother's subversive activities. She came to know about the White Rose as most others did, by reading the leaflets. But her suspicions were aroused when she found Hans's volume of Schiller texts in which he had underlined precisely the same passages as the leaflet quoted. She confronted him, first scolding him for the danger he was placing himself and their family in. Hans was defiant. When she saw she could not change his mind, Sophie decided her only choice was to join the White Rose. The organization's operations were interrupted temporarily in August of 1942, when Hans and the other men of the White Rose Circle were called to the Russian front. But when they reconvened in January of 1943, their ambitions had grown. Their resistance became more brazen and more dangerous. They decided to mail the next set of leaflets, the 5th and the 6th, from several different cities to give the authorities the impression of a widespread resistance network. This entailed traveling by train with suitcases full of subversive literature, a deeply risky endeavor. Even more bold were the several nights Hans, Alex, and another one of the core members of the White Rose, Willy Graf, faced public buildings with graffiti, slogans reading "Down with Hitler," and crossed out swastikas. These increasingly perilous actions made some in the White Rose Circle uncomfortable, most notably Christoph Probst, who advocated a more cautious route. But they did not heed his warning, and instead chose to undertake what was perhaps their most brash act, to distribute the leaflets at the University of Munich in broad daylight. And of course, this decision would cost the Scholls and many other members of the White Rose their lives. In retrospect, it's perhaps easy to see their actions on February 18th as reckless, and their ensuing capture as perhaps avoidable. But their eventual capture was in some sense inevitable. The scale of the actions that they felt morally obligated to undertake simply outstripped their ability to execute upon their vision. They may not have meant to die, but one cannot imagine they were ignorant of its probability. This fact will be the focus of our next musical excerpt, which is comprised of 2 sections. The first juxtaposes fragments from the White Rose leaflets themselves against a portion of Psalm 13 that Sophie had copied into her diary: "Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." The second section is structured around excerpts of the Scholls' indictment and sentencing, interspersed with quotes from the Gospels and again from the Nicene Creed.